Hello, everyone. My name is Tamar Natobishvili, and we're happy to continue our interview series with Dr. Gergana Nucheva. Dr. Nucheva is an associate professor in international relations and European foreign policy at Maastricht University, with a PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. And her research focuses on the European neighborhood policy and democratization in the Balkans and post-Soviet space. Welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Given your extensive research on the European neighborhood policy, how do you assess its impact on democratization efforts in Balkans and the post-Soviet space? Are there specific success or challenges that stand out to you?
The debate in EU foreign policy has always been about normative drivers versus strategic drivers. And the earlier discussions were more focused on the normative side of the arguments. Now, the geopolitical or the strategic argumentation of why they is doing certain things in the Balkans and in the former Soviet space more generally is a recent line of argumentation, especially in light of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the whole geopolitical awakening, that's the term that's used, the whole geopolitical awakening of the EU. Now, I personally see that the EU has been driven by both norms and interests throughout the period. So I don't necessarily see that there's a big change in terms of substantive policy. The rhetoric might have changed, and the EU might have toned down some of the normative framing of its policies, but and it might have toned up some of the strategic frames in justifying its policies. But both dimensions, in my view, have been present throughout the period, the last 2 or 3 decades that we are looking at. But just describing that, geopolitics is now trumping the normative side of arguments is, in my view, not entirely correct, because the accession to the EU is all about democracy and rule of law and sharing a certain political acquis with the member states. And I don't think that the consensus within the EU has crumbled on that question. So the more a country comes closer to the EU, the more the EU will emphasize the normative dimension.
In your book, European Foreign Policy and the Challenges of Balkan Accession, you discuss conditionality and compliance. How effective has the EU's conditionality approach been in driving political reforms in Eastern and Central European countries aspiring for EU membership?
From what's been happening in the Balkans and the post-Soviet space in the last 2 or 3 decades, we know that they're not democratizing in the way in which most people expected, and they are not repeating the success story of Central and Eastern Europe prior to the EU accession. Now, the question is, what explains this lack of democratization, and in some instances it's even a reversal towards autocratic practices. Now, one big part of the debate is about the EU and what the EU has done right and what the EU has done wrong. Now, certainly with the Balkans, the EU has not played out the game very well, because all the incentives that it offered to the region were very slow to materialize, and the EU lost credibility in the process. Now, not everything is the fault of the EU, of course. There's also a lot of local dynamics that work against democratization in the Balkans. But if I can single out one element that is positive, this is civil society, and how occasionally it mobilizes to keep political elites in check. Now, civil society hasn't been that strong, but it's gaining strength. And so this is one positive factor that I want to single out as a success story of a sort. Now, the post-Soviet space is a bit different There, the EU was very weak as a policy from the start, so there was no accession prospect to drive this process of political change. But there, regardless of a very, very weak EU policy, we have democratization successes here and there. And certainly Georgia, until the current episode, is one of them. And I would also single out Moldova and Ukraine. They have been into ups and downs throughout these 2-3 decades, but overall the trajectory is positive. And if I can think of an explanatory factor that's probably has had the most weight, that's certainly domestic, and that certainly comes from civil society and the fact that these citizens identify with Europe. And they view the EU project as a legitimate aspiration for their societies. And so that's the big driver of positive change, in my view.
Lastly, your work often explores the balance between normative and strategic interests in EU foreign policy. How do you see this balance playing out in the EU's current policies towards Eastern and Central Europe, like particularly in light of recent geopolitical developments?
So how effective is the EU conditionality? Now, the EU was very effective in Central and Eastern Europe and less so in the Western Balkans. Now, most of the debate is about the EU incentives and how giving such a strong material signal to the political elites in the region drove the whole process. Again, I come from the academic debate that emphasizes legitimacy, the legitimacy of this whole process. So for me, why the EU was successful in Central and Eastern Europe and less so in the Balkans has to do with the fact that it was perceived very legitimate by the Central and Eastern Europeans back then to go down the European path. And in the Western Balkans, the whole idea of going back to Europe is legitimate, but the EU has had to intervene in very sensitive sovereignty questions. And this has taken away some of its credibility. And as a result of it, the EU is less of a driver of change for democratization processes in the Western Balkans, because there we have the very, very complicated legacy of the conflicts of the 90s. And that's, for me, explains a big part of why we see such a difference in compliance patterns between the two groups of countries.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nucheva, for sharing your valuable insights with us today and your expertise on the European neighborhood policy and the democratization in Eastern and Central Europe has provided us with a deeper understanding of these complex issues. So we appreciate your time and look forward to future discussions. Thank you so much.